My name is Harold Peters. I'm 74 years old, a retired high school history teacher, a widower, and according to my sons, a man who can no longer be trusted with his own life. I live alone now, in the same red brick house in suburban Pennsylvania where my late wife Margaret and I raised our family. The floors creak in the same places. The boiler still rumbles at night like a sleepy old animal. There's ivy crawling up the back wall like it always has, even after I trimmed it back 2 months ago. Nothing has really changed, and yet everything has. Margaret's absence is not something I've ever gotten used to. After 47 years of marriage, the silence left in her place is not just quiet. It's an echo, a living reminder of someone who used to hum when she cooked, who would always leave the porch light on for me when I came home late from the school, who had a different kind of laugh for each of our grandchildren, and who could still, even in her final days, make me feel like a young man with the way she looked at me over her morning tea. Margaret passed away 5 years ago. The official cause was heart failure, but it was a slow fading, not sudden, not dramatic. The kind of dying that happens gradually and leaves everyone around it unsure of when exactly it began. I cared for her during the last year of her life as best I could. It was not heroic, nothing like the movies. It was quiet, sad work. Dressing her when she couldn't manage the buttons, reading to her when her eyesight failed, helping her to the bathroom at night, brushing her silver-white hair into a neat bun the way she liked it. It was love, and it was hard, and I'd do it again if I had to. After she was gone, the days flattened into each other. Grief is not just a feeling, it's a geography you live in. You stop answering the phone, you forget to eat lunch, you sleep too much or not at all. You begin talking to the pictures on the wall, not like a madman, but like someone trying to keep the room from collapsing into meaninglessness. My sons, Grant and David, began hovering around me after Margaret's funeral. Grant is the older one, a finance consultant in Philadelphia with a perpetual Bluetooth headset in his ear and an opinion on everything from the stock market to the best way to poach eggs. David is a software engineer, quieter, but always watching, always analyzing, like every interaction is a problem he needs to solve. I love them both, though I will admit I no longer understand either of them. They come to visit once a month, always together, like it's a performance review. They inspect the kitchen. They check the mail piled on the counter. They ask about my glucose levels, about my sleeping patterns, about whether I've remembered to refill my prescriptions. Grant once opened my fridge and frowned like he'd just discovered a dead bird. "Dad, you can't live like this," he said, holding up a half-empty jar of pickles like it was evidence of my decline. David, always the more diplomatic one, suggested we talk about options. That was the beginning of what they called the transition conversation. They spoke of assisted living facilities with on-site medical staff and social activities. They showed me glossy brochures with smiling old people playing cards and doing yoga, all bathed in golden afternoon light. They spoke of community, of safety, of simplicity. I asked if they meant to put me in a home. Grant flinched at the word. "It's not a home, Dad. It's a lifestyle solution." I told them I had a solution of my own. They could both leave, and I'd be fine. They did leave that time, but they came back 2 weeks later with papers. They called it a limited durable power of attorney. "Just a precaution," they said. "Just something in case of a medical emergency." I looked at the legalese, didn't understand most of it, and signed it. I'd always been a man who trusted family. I assumed it was what they said it was, but I noticed after that visit that the tone of their conversations changed. They stopped asking questions and started giving instructions. "We'll take care of the bills, Dad. You don't need to worry about the property taxes. Just focus on your health." I didn't realize at the time that I had begun to vanish, not physically, but legally, emotionally. My autonomy was being eroded slowly, politely, like the edge of a coin worn down in someone's pocket over years. One morning, about 6 months after I signed the papers, Grant and David showed up with a real estate agent. We found a buyer for the house. Grant said, smiling as if this were a favor. You'll get a good sum, and we can put that toward your retirement living. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. When I realized it wasn't, I asked how they could sell something that wasn't theirs. David looked almost apologetic. Technically, with the power of attorney, we can act in your best interests. I told them my best interest was staying in the only home I'd ever known. They shrugged. They said the papers were already signed. They told me not to worry. I would have a private room in a good facility with meals and laundry and scheduled medication. The day they moved me into the facility, I stood in the driveway holding a small suitcase and watching strangers carry my belongings into a moving van. Margaret's favorite armchair. My book collection. The framed photograph of our wedding. They promised to store them for me. We'll put everything in climate-controlled storage, David said, like that was a comfort. The facility was called Maple Oaks. It had floral wallpaper and a dining hall that smelled faintly of overcooked vegetables. My room was small, with a single bed, a beige armchair, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. The staff were polite, but brisk. My roommate, Frank, was 82 and spoke to his dead wife every night before bed. He thought I was named George. I didn't correct him. In the weeks that followed, my sons came to visit less and less. The phone calls stopped first, then the texts. I'd ask the staff if I had any messages. They'd shake their heads. I spent my days sitting in the common room, watching television shows I didn't like, eating bland food, taking my pills from a small paper cup, and wondering what Margaret would say if she saw me now. Sometimes, at night, I'd walk the perimeter of the small garden behind the facility, gripping the handrail, trying to remind myself that I was still a person, not just a body waiting to die. I heard other residents crying in their rooms. I heard staff whispering about fall risks and code yellows. I began to dream of escape, not in a dramatic way, but in a practical one. A return, a reclaiming. But I had no money, no house, no car, and, apparently, no legal standing. I was, in the eyes of my sons, just a logistical concern, a responsibility to be managed. And yet I wasn't gone. Not yet. It's a strange thing, realizing that your own children see you not as a person, but as a liability. I had raised them to be independent, to value honesty, to protect what matters. I took them camping, read them history books, attended every school concert and soccer game. I taught them how to drive. I helped them with their student loans. I held their hands when they got scared during thunderstorms. I was there when they were weak. Now that I was weak, they had disappeared. But not entirely. They still controlled my accounts. They still kept a close eye on what little was left of my pension. They cared about my money, just not me. I began to keep notes. Small things. A ledger of how many times they called. Records of what they said. Copies of the forms I had signed. I began to reread every document they had handed me. I spent my days at the facility library, learning about elder law. I talked to one of the nurses, a kind woman named Renata, who had seen too many cases like mine. She gave me a number of a legal aid group that worked with seniors. I called it from the facility's landline one rainy afternoon, and a young woman named Mariah answered. She asked me to tell her everything, and I did. Not because I thought she could fix it, but because I had to tell someone. By the end of the call, she told me I still had rights, that there were ways to fight back, that I was not as powerless as I had been made to feel. That was the first time in a long while that I felt something stir inside me, a flicker of resolve, a faint echo of the man I used to be. They said I wouldn't survive on my own, that I needed them, that I was no longer capable. But what they didn't understand is that a man who has nothing left to lose is not someone to pity. He is someone to fear. I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet, but I would find a way back. I would reclaim what they stole, not just the money, not just the house, but my dignity, my identity, my name, because I'm still Harold Peters, and I'm not done yet. The first time I realized something was deeply wrong wasn't during a confrontation or some dramatic moment, but while reading the facility's financial disclosure form. It had been handed to me casually one morning with my breakfast tray, along with a smile and "We just need a quick signature, Mr. Peters." I almost signed it without reading, but something made me pause. Maybe it was the tone in the aide's voice, too cheerful, too practiced, or maybe it was the fact that Grant hadn't called in over a month, not even for my birthday, though he used to be obsessive about reminders and calendars. I took the form back to my room and sat down in the hard armchair beneath the window, unfolded the pages, and began to read carefully. The numbers didn't make sense. The facility costs were higher than I remembered, and there were recurring transfers listed, amounts of several $1,000s each month from my retirement account to something labeled Peters Family Trust. That was the first time I'd heard of such a trust. I hadn't authorized any new financial structure. I hadn't met with any estate planner. My wife and I had always kept things simple. No trusts, no shell corporations, no offshore accounts. Just a modest pension, savings, and a will. I stared at the print until my eyes blurred. That night, I called the legal aid line again, and Mariah answered. I told her about the form, about the transfers, about the family trust. There was a long silence on the other end before she said, quietly but firmly, "Mr. Peters, I think your sons may have moved your assets into a shared trust without your full informed consent. If they used the power of attorney to do it, and you weren't aware, that's a breach of fiduciary duty." I asked what that meant in plain English. She said it meant they might have committed fraud. She told me not to sign anything else and to send her copies of all the documents I had. I didn't have access to a scanner or email, but the facility had a fax machine in the staff office. The next morning, I waited until most of the aides were distracted in the dining hall and slipped into the office. The fax machine was old and loud, but it worked. I sent the forms, the bank statements, the trust document I had copied from the staff folder when no one was looking. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. 2 days later, Mariah called back, her tone more serious than ever. She said that based on what I'd sent, there was enough evidence to request a formal investigation. But that would take time. In the meantime, she urged me to request a full accounting of my assets from the bank directly, without going through my sons. That was easier said than done. With the power of attorney still in effect, the bank refused to talk to me. "We're sorry, sir, but financial decisions are being managed by your designated representatives," the young woman on the phone said, as though I were a child asking about my allowance. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall for a long time. This was not just inconvenience. This was erasure. I had become invisible in my own financial life. But then something small shifted. Frank, my roommate, whose mind wandered in and out of lucidity like fog across a valley, asked me one night if I wanted to escape. I laughed. "Escape where?" I asked. "They always leave the back gate open." He whispered. "I used to be a locksmith. The keypad's just for show." I thought it was nonsense. But later that night, I wandered to the garden again, as I often did, and casually tested the gate. It swung open with the gentlest pull. It wasn't locked at all. Not really. I stood there for a long time, staring at the dark street beyond. The sky was clear, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the air of freedom. Cool, uncertain, a little terrifying. I didn't walk through it that night. but the knowledge stayed with me. A week later, a letter arrived. It was from Grant. Not a card or a personal note, just a printout on corporate letterhead with a dry, sterile tone. Dear Dad, we've arranged for a financial advisor to better manage the distribution of your remaining assets. As we are currently handling all expenditures related to your care, please sign and return the enclosed agreement allowing the transfer of your remaining holdings into managed portfolios. This will ensure your comfort and security for the years ahead. There was a line near the bottom that read, "If we do not receive this signed agreement by the 15th, we will proceed with automatic consolidation per the durable power of attorney." The language was manipulative, legalistic, and final. I read it 3 times. Margaret would have been furious. That was the moment I knew. They were no longer pretending to be cautious or caring. They were laying claim to what wasn't theirs. Not just the money, but my legacy, my voice, my autonomy. They saw me as a decaying asset to be managed, liquidated, and eventually disposed of. I sat down and wrote a letter in return. Not to Grant or David, but to Mariah. I told her I was ready to fight. Whatever it took. I wasn't afraid anymore. What else could they take from me? My pride, already gone. My home, already sold. My reputation, already diminished. What remained was something they couldn't touch. Not if I moved fast enough. Mariah connected me with a private elder law attorney who agreed to work pro bono once he reviewed the documents. His name was Ellis Kane, a no-nonsense man in his 50s who had the voice of someone used to courtrooms and reluctant judges. He drove out to meet me one Thursday morning under the pretense of being a visiting family friend to avoid staff suspicion. We spoke in the facility garden, sitting on a weather-worn bench under a crabapple tree. I told him everything, and he listened intently. When I finished, he looked at me with something like admiration. "They underestimated you," he said. "Most people in your situation don't fight back. But you're still here. You're still lucid. And you're still angry. That's a good place to start." He promised to file an emergency motion to suspend the power of attorney on grounds of misuse and to request immediate restitution of assets. 2 days later, Ellis returned with more documents. I signed an affidavit, and he filed the petition that same afternoon. Meanwhile, Mariah had begun tracking the financial paper trail. What she discovered was both appalling and validating. Grant had opened a joint investment account with my funds. David had used my pension payments to buy himself a new electric car. The Peters Family Trust had been registered in Delaware and managed through an umbrella account that made tracing withdrawals deliberately opaque. My money, my life's work, had become a slush fund for my children's ambitions. It was no longer about protecting me, it was about controlling me. But now the tide had turned. Ellis warned me that retaliation might come quickly. If Grant and David suspected I was taking action, they might try to preempt me by pushing for medical declaration of incapacity. "They'll say you're confused," he said. "They'll say you're being manipulated. You need to be prepared for that." I nodded. I'd already felt the sting of those accusations, even before they were said aloud. Every patronizing tone, every eye roll, every time they spoke over me in meetings with bank clerks or medical staff. They saw me as irrelevant, a fading mind in an aging body. I asked Ellis what I needed to do. He said the most important step was to obtain a formal medical evaluation, proof of cognitive competence. I agreed without hesitation. I wanted no one to have any doubt about my state of mind. I met with a neurologist, a psychiatrist, and a gerontologist, all of whom evaluated me independently. The results were clear. I was of sound mind, capable of managing my affairs, and fully aware of recent events. Their signed statements would accompany the court motion. It would be hard, if not impossible, for Grant and David to argue otherwise. One morning, as I waited in the common room for Ellis to call, a staff member approached me with a new form to sign. "Just a routine update for your records," she said. I smiled politely and asked to read it first. It was a transfer authorization, one that would have moved the rest of my pension into an account under Grant's control. I handed it back without a word. That night, I began packing a small duffel bag with what few belongings I had: a change of clothes, my personal documents, and a photograph of Margaret. I waited until the nurses changed shifts, then slipped out through the garden gate. It was unlocked, just like Frank said. I walked 2 miles to the nearest bus station. My legs ached, and I had to stop often, but I made it. I had stashed $50 in cash over the last few weeks from my small personal allowance, and it was enough for a ticket into the city. Mariah had arranged a temporary place for me to stay with one of her colleagues until the court date. I slept that night in a real bed, in a small guest room that smelled of lemon detergent and books. I felt something I hadn't in a long time, not just relief, but possibility. I was free. Not legally, not yet, but spiritually, emotionally. I was a man again, not a patient, not a ward, not a dependent. The fight had only begun, but I was no longer alone, and I was no longer afraid. The guest room where I stayed for those first few nights of freedom belonged to a woman named Esther Klein, a paralegal who worked part-time with the elder law non-profit that Mariah had contacted on my behalf. She was in her early 60s, with a streak of silver in her tightly pulled-back hair, and a no-nonsense air that reminded me of the high school principals I used to report to during my teaching years. Esther didn't ask many questions, which I appreciated. She had cleared the small guest bedroom in her row house for me, left clean towels folded on the dresser, and simply said, "You'll stay until we sort things out." I spent most of the first day sleeping, my body finally relaxing in a way it hadn't in months. When I woke the next morning, I felt an unfamiliar ache, not physical, but emotional. It was the ache of having no plan, no address, no defined place in the world. I was in legal limbo and personal exile. Ellis, my lawyer, called that afternoon. He said the court date had been set for the following week, and in the meantime, he advised me to remain off the radar. He warned that if my sons discovered my location, they might try to have me returned to the facility under the pretense of concern for my safety. "They'll frame it as a wellness intervention," he said. "It'll sound nice on paper, but once they get you back inside, you might not come out again." His words weren't melodramatic. I had seen how easily power and benevolence could be manipulated to justify control. I told him I had no intention of making myself visible until we had the court ruling. The days passed slowly. I read newspapers cover to cover, brewed my own coffee, strong, bitter, how I liked it, and took long walks through the neighborhood, always wary of passing vehicles, always avoiding busy intersections. Esther's house was quiet, filled with books on law and art, and smelled faintly of sandalwood. Sometimes we talked in the evenings. She told me about her late husband, a union organizer who had died of cancer 10 years earlier, and how their daughter now lived across the country and rarely called. There was no self-pity in her voice, only acceptance. She said something one night over tea that stayed with me. "People think loneliness is what kills you, but really it's the humiliation of being forgotten, of being ignored, of becoming a footnote in other people's lives." I understood that perfectly. A few days before the court date, Ellis informed me that my sons had filed a motion of their own, a petition questioning my mental competence and requesting full conservatorship. They had, apparently, submitted statements from a facility physician claiming signs of memory loss, disorientation, and vulnerability to manipulation. I almost laughed when I heard that. The very people who had manipulated and deceived me were now claiming I was the one being led astray. "We anticipated this," Ellis said. "Their argument rests on proving you incapable of handling your affairs. We'll respond with the independent medical evaluations and your affidavit detailing the sequence of events. But you should be prepared. They'll try to discredit you personally." That word, discredit, lodged in my chest like a splinter. They weren't just trying to steal my money anymore, they were trying to erase my personhood. The hearing was held in a modest courthouse, the kind with peeling linoleum floors and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above everything. Ellis and I sat on one side of the small courtroom. Across from us were Grant and David, flanked by a suited man with slicked back hair who looked like he'd learned compassion from a textbook and promptly discarded it. My sons barely glanced at me. Grant looked impatient, tapping his foot, while David stared at the table as if trying to bore a hole through the wood. When the judge entered, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a sharp tone, we all rose. The proceedings began. Grant's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of an aging man in decline, a man who had recently wandered away from a care facility, who had shown increasing paranoia, who had allegedly been taken advantage of by legal strangers. He cited the facility doctor's statement, vague notes about confusion during morning medication and repetition during conversation, none of which had any context or specific dates. Then he turned to me. This man who had changed their father's mailing address, refused contact, and was now, according to them, under the influence of people who wanted access to his estate. The whole narrative was so inverted it felt surreal, as if they were describing someone else. I wanted to shout, but Ellis placed a calming hand on my arm and stood to speak. He presented the cognitive assessments first, 3 independent doctors who had all confirmed my competence. He then submitted the signed power of attorney documents, highlighting how they had been used not for my benefit, but to funnel funds into accounts inaccessible to me. He read from my affidavit, the passages I had written late at night in Esther's guest room, the words trembling with the rage and clarity of someone watching their life dismantled piece by piece. He pointed out that I had voluntarily left the facility through an unlocked door, not fled like a confused patient, and that I had acted with legal counsel every step of the way. "This is not a man in decline," Ellis concluded. "This is a man who has been betrayed by his own family and is now fighting for the right to live as himself again." When I was called to the stand, I stood slowly, my legs stiff from sitting, but my back straight. I looked at the judge, not my sons. I spoke calmly, clearly, recounting the events of the past 6 months. I did not weep. I did not accuse. I simply told the truth. I described the house where I had lived for 40 years, the moment I realized it had been sold without my knowledge, the silence that followed, the indignity of being told when to eat and when to sleep, the humiliation of seeing my pension become someone else's plaything. I told the judge I did not want revenge. I wanted dignity, autonomy, a chance to decide what was left of my life without gatekeepers or supervisors. When I stepped down, I finally looked at Grant and David. Their expressions were unreadable. Perhaps they believed everything their lawyer had said. Perhaps they didn't. Maybe they had convinced themselves that what they'd done was justified, that I had needed their help, that taking control was an act of love. Or maybe they simply didn't care anymore. The judge called a recess. We waited in tense silence. When she returned, she ruled that the power of attorney was hereby revoked, that I was legally competent, and that a full accounting of all transactions made under that power must be submitted to the court within 30 days. Grant's lawyer asked to appeal. The judge refused. She said the evidence was too strong. Outside the courthouse, the sky had clouded over. I stood on the sidewalk, breathing deeply, as if the air itself had become a little lighter. Ellis shook my hand, then pulled me briefly into an awkward but genuine embrace. "You did well," he said. "You stood your ground." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I was tired, not just physically, but in my bones, in the part of me that had been pushing back against the tide of erasure for so long that now, with the tide receding, I didn't know what to do with the stillness. That night, back at Esther's, I sat by the window and stared out at the quiet street. I thought of Margaret, of the porch where we used to sit in the evenings, listening to crickets, holding hands in silence. I thought of how proud she would be, not of the legal victory, but of the simple fact that I had fought, that I hadn't let them turn me into a ghost. I wasn't whole yet. I didn't have my money back. I didn't have a home. But I had a name, I had a voice, and I had made them listen. The first shot had been fired, and for the first time I wasn't the one bleeding. The days following the court ruling passed with a sense of suspended weight, like a pendulum finally held still in the air, waiting to fall one way or another. Legally, I had regained my autonomy, my voice, my status as a man no longer deemed incapable of managing his own life, but emotionally, the aftermath felt like stepping out of a burning building and realizing the world outside had changed while you were inside choking on smoke. The court hadn't restored what was stolen, it had merely stopped the theft. The question remained, how much damage had already been done? And how would I begin to reclaim not just my financial assets, but my identity, my past, the continuity of my life that my sons had tried to rupture in their sterile calculations about my decline? I returned to Esther's house that night, not as a fugitive or a patient, but as a man who had survived something invisible and brutal, and for that I felt a strange kind of grief, not for the loss of money or property, but for the discovery that the very people I had once hoped would carry forward my name had tried instead to bury me alive in a narrative of incompetence. Ellis advised that we act quickly to trace and freeze any accounts linked to the fraudulent trust. Mariah, who had continued her financial sleuthing with the zeal of someone deeply offended by injustice, presented us with a detailed report of every transaction my sons had made since acquiring the power of attorney. It was worse than I expected. They had liquidated a large portion of my investment portfolio, moved funds through various brokerage accounts, and even used my name to co-sign a personal loan that Grant had taken out for his new business venture, some kind of boutique consultancy firm that, according to the website, specialized in legacy asset transformation. A cruel irony, given how efficiently he had attempted to transform my legacy into his. The total amount redirected or spent without my informed consent approached $200,000. Some of it might be recoverable, Ellis said, but much of it was likely gone for good, wrapped in the silk of legal ambiguity or lost in the fog of shared familial intent. The revelation shook me, but not as much as the next one. A week after the court ruling, I received a letter in the mail, forwarded from my old address. It was from the real estate agency that had handled the sale of my house. Inside was a statement of sale, listing the buyers, the sale price, and the signatories. My name was missing entirely. I was not listed as a seller, not acknowledged as an owner. The property, the very place where Margaret and I had built our life together, had been sold as if I'd never existed. I stared at the paper, reading and rereading the names, Grant Peters and David Peters, printed neatly in the owner field. I felt as if I were reading a forged obituary. It wasn't just a house, it was the physical memory of everything I had worked for, laughed in, cried in, prayed within. And now it was someone else's. And legally, I hadn't even been counted as present. That night, I sat in the dark with the document in my lap and thought about a conversation I'd once had with Margaret on our 25th anniversary. We were sitting in the backyard under the stars, sipping red wine from mismatched glasses. And she'd said, if we lost everything, the house, the savings, the furniture, but still had each other, I'd be fine. But if I lost the feeling of being seen by you, if I stopped existing in your eyes, That would be the real end. I understood now what she meant. My sons hadn't just taken things from me, they had stopped seeing me as a person. They had looked at me and seen a liability, a hindrance, an aging complication. They had erased me from their mental ledger and redrawn me as a column of assets, a number, a problem to be optimized. And the cruelest part was that they had done it under the banner of care. Fueled by this violation, I made a decision that I had not considered until that moment. I would not simply reclaim what I could. I would not simply build a quiet life somewhere in the shadows of what had been lost. No, I would make my presence undeniable. I would take action not just to recover, but to disrupt. If they had erased me from the narrative, I would rewrite the narrative entirely. Ellis was cautious when I told him my plan, but he didn't try to dissuade me. "It's bold," he said, "and it'll get messy, but you're within your rights." I nodded. I wasn't afraid of messy anymore. The plan was simple, legally speaking. Because the house had once been jointly owned between Margaret and me, and had passed to me by survivorship, any transfer of ownership without my signature could be challenged, provided I could prove that my consent had been forged or obtained under duress. The key would be accessing the original deed and transfer documents. With Ellis's help, we subpoenaed the real estate firm, demanding the full transaction record, including digital signature logs, email correspondences, and notarized statements. What we received was a mountain of paperwork, but within it a single line stood out. My signature, electronically applied on a transfer authorization dated 2 months after I had moved into the facility. I had never signed it. I didn't even have access to email at that time. Ellis had it analyzed by a forensic handwriting expert who confirmed what we already knew. It was a digital forgery. The file metadata revealed it had been uploaded from Grant's office computer. With that, we had grounds not only for civil litigation, but for potential criminal charges: fraud, forgery, elder abuse. Ellis asked me how far I wanted to go. I told him as far as it would take. Not out of vengeance, but because this was no longer just about me. This was about every older man and woman silenced by their children's polite condescension, every aging voice drowned out by the sound of inheritance calculators clicking in the background. It was about making it known that to grow old was not to become less human, less worthy, less real. It was a statement. I am still here. By the end of that week, we had filed a formal civil suit against both of my sons, demanding restitution of funds, reversal of the property sale, and damages for emotional distress. We filed a complaint with the state's Elder Protection Services. We submitted the forensic report to the district attorney's office. Ellis warned that retaliation would come quickly, and it did. The very next day, I received an email from David, of all people. It was the first direct contact he had made in months. It was long, defensive, full of passive-aggressive phrases like, "We only ever wanted what was best," and "You left us no choice." He begged me to drop the suit. He said that making this public would ruin him professionally, that Grant's business would collapse, that I was jeopardizing their families. "We're still your sons," he wrote. "Please don't destroy us." I read the message several times, searching for one phrase, any phrase, that sounded like genuine remorse. There was none, only fear. Not for me, but for themselves. I did not reply. In the weeks that followed the filing of the lawsuit, the tempo of everything in my life seemed to shift into a strange and relentless rhythm. Not frantic like panic, nor slow like waiting for a storm to pass, but steady and sharpened, like the mechanical movement of a clock winding toward something irreversible. The gears of justice, long dormant in my world, had begun to turn, and with each passing day I could feel their movement dragging the truth upward from the depth where it had been buried under paperwork, legalese, and the false smiles of sons who had Learned long ago how to exploit trust without ever openly betraying it. Ellis handled most of the frontline communication with the opposing counsel, but even at a distance, I felt the heat rising. Emails arrived now with vaguely threatening tones, requests to settle quietly, and subtle insinuations that continuing the case would hurt everyone involved. When those failed, the tone shifted into something more sinister. Accusations that I was being manipulated by outsiders, that I didn't understand what I was doing, that perhaps my newly restored autonomy was in fact a product of undue influence. It was classic projection. They had used my signature as a weapon, and now they feared mine was being used against them. I moved out of Esther's guest room and into a modest apartment on the west side of the city, a small but dignified place with a single bedroom, a narrow balcony, and just enough space for a desk, a few bookshelves, and the old leather chair I had. Retrieved from storage, one of the only pieces of my former life that hadn't been sold, donated, or accidentally lost. I furnished the rest sparingly, preferring order over nostalgia, clarity over clutter. Each item I brought in, every cup, every lamp, every framed photo of Margaret, was chosen with care, as if by exercising choice again in the material details of life, I could remind myself that I was still the author of my own narrative. I kept a file drawer beside my desk, filled with every document related to the case, and each morning I reviewed the contents with a diligence that surprised even me. It wasn't obsession, exactly. It was preparation. I knew that to dismantle what my sons had built under the guise of care, I had to be thorough, methodical, and unwilling to be baited by their increasingly desperate pleas for mercy, disguised as family concern. The media caught wind of the lawsuit about a month in, after Ellis quietly reached out to a local journalist he trusted. The story appeared under the headline, "Retired Teacher Sues Sons for Fraud, Abuse of Power of Attorney," and from the moment it ran, everything changed. People began to contact me. Some from my past, former students, colleagues, even distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in decades. But most were strangers, men and women in their 60s, 70s, 80s, who had read the article and wanted to tell me their own stories of betrayal, of being treated like burdens, of watching their families morph into predators behind the mask, of doing what's best. One man wrote that his daughter had moved him into a facility and emptied his bank account in 3 months. Another said his grandson had tricked him into signing over the deed to the family farm. They were from different towns, different backgrounds, different lives, but they all shared the same wound. They had been made to feel disposable. I read every letter. I answered as many as I could. Some made me cry. Some made me furious. All of them steeled my resolve. Grant and David, by contrast, seemed to dissolve under the pressure. Their lawyer changed twice, and the tone of their correspondence shifted from defiant to erratic to vaguely pitiful. Grant tried to reach me directly through a mutual acquaintance, leaving a voicemail that began with a forced laugh and ended in what sounded like barely contained rage. He accused me of being vindictive, of not understanding the damage I was doing, and then pivoted into a threat. "If you keep this up, I swear to God I will countersue you for defamation and emotional distress. I have nothing left to lose." I didn't return the call. Instead, I instructed Ellis to prepare for whatever counterattack they might attempt. We fortified our claims, gathered more witnesses, former neighbors who testified about the way Grant and David had restricted my visitors after Margaret's death, facility staff willing to attest to my mental clarity and the isolation I had endured. Even Renata, the nurse who had first given me the elder law number, agreed to provide a statement. "You were never confused," she wrote. "You were just grieving, and no one gave you time to grieve. They wanted you quiet, compliant, tucked away." The forensic evidence regarding the forged digital signature proved crucial. Once Ellis submitted it to the court, along with metadata showing the exact computer and IP address used to authorize the house sale, their entire narrative began to crumble. The house was the centerpiece of our case, not just symbolically but legally. Because they had sold it without my participation, and because the title had once been jointly held with Margaret, it gave us leverage not just for restitution, but for reversion. We could, if the court agreed, reverse the sale entirely or demand damages equivalent to its full market value. That terrified them. Their emails became more panicked. At one point they offered to settle, quietly, without admission of guilt, in exchange for a modest cash payment and a mutual non-disclosure agreement. I said no. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the record, about the truth. Meanwhile, the state's Elder Abuse Task Force began its own investigation, and things grew colder, more clinical, and more real. Agents interviewed staff at the facility, reviewed my medical records, and subpoenaed bank statements. They asked me to recount events I had tried not to think about. The day I was moved into the facility, the moment I discovered my accounts were locked, the first time I was denied access to my own bank balance. I told them everything. I didn't flinch. I had spent too many years excusing the small humiliations in the name of family harmony, pretending the cutting remarks were just jokes, that the absence of visits was due to work, that the disregard for my preferences was a byproduct of generational differences. But those things, I saw now, were not minor. They were the beginning of a slow campaign of erosion, a steady chipping away of the person I used to be. And now I was making sure that each of those chips was accounted for. The court hearing to determine damages arrived like a thundercloud at the end of a long, dry season. The courtroom was fuller this time. Media sat in the back, scribbling in notebooks, recording on phones. I sat beside Ellis, wearing my best suit, the one I had worn to Margaret's funeral, and though it hung a little looser now around the shoulders, it still carried weight, memory, and meaning. Grant and David looked hollowed out, tired, pale, and visibly nervous. Their new attorney was younger, more aggressive, and his opening remarks were filled with buzzwords: miscommunication, family tension, generational misunderstanding. But the judge, now fully briefed and visibly unimpressed by their pattern of behavior, interrupted him twice to ask direct questions about the timeline of the forged signature, the misuse of power of attorney, and the disappearance of over $180,000 from the trust account. Their lawyer fumbled. David looked ready to collapse. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly and walked to the witness stand. I had prepared something to read, but decided at the last moment to speak from the heart. I told the court that I had been a teacher for 41 years, a husband for 47, a father for over 5 decades. I said that in all that time, I had tried to live with integrity, to lead with patience, to forgive more than I condemned. But I said also that forgiveness required truth, and that truth had been absent from my son's actions. They had not merely failed me. They had erased me, willingly and strategically, to gain control of things that were not theirs to take. I ended by saying that I did not wish them harm, but I did wish them accountability. And I hoped that one day, when they were old and uncertain and looking into the eyes of their own children, they would remember this moment and understand that love without respect is not love at all, it's possession. The judge ruled in my favor. Full financial restitution, punitive damages, legal fees covered, and most importantly, a public record that the house had been fraudulently sold, my signature illegally used, my autonomy unjustly revoked. It was over, or as over as such things ever truly are. The media headlines changed. Elder fraud case ends in victory. Father wins against sons in emotional abuse suit. Retired teacher reclaims life. Friends began calling again. Neighbors I hadn't seen in years left letters in my mailbox. I received an invitation to speak at a conference on elder justice. I declined. I didn't want to be a symbol. I wanted to rest. And yet there was one thing left undone. I requested a final mediation session, not for legal reasons, but personal ones. Ellis advised against it, but I insisted. I needed to see their eyes one last time. Grant and David agreed, perhaps thinking they could persuade me to retract my public statements or withdraw my consent for further prosecution. We met in a private room at the courthouse, just the three of us. No lawyers, no recorders, no witnesses. For several minutes, no one spoke. Finally, I looked at them. Really looked. Grant had grown grey at the temples. David's hands trembled slightly. They looked older, wearier, smaller than I remembered. "You can say what you came to say," I offered. Grant shook his head. "We didn't come to say anything," he replied. "You made your point." David cleared his throat. "Are you happy now?" he asked. "You got everything you wanted. Our reputations are destroyed." I nodded slowly. That was never the goal, but if reputation was built on lies, then perhaps destruction is just correction. Grant looked at me, eyes hard. "You're not the man I thought you were." "No," I said. "I'm not the man you wanted me to be, quiet, passive, compliant. I'm the man who raised you better than this, and now I'm the man who watched you choose to forget that." They didn't reply. They stood and walked out together, and for the first time, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt released. In the weeks following the court's final ruling and the awkward silence of that last mediation, I found myself caught in a strange current of contradictory emotions. Relief, certainly, but also a deep, quiet grief that seemed to settle somewhere in. The chest and refused to move. It wasn't grief for lost money or the house, though those were not insignificant. It was something colder and sharper. Grief for the irreversible shift that had occurred in the landscape of what I once called family. That word, once warm and full of echoing laughter, now felt clinical, detached, like a term from a medical chart describing a former condition. I had not just fought a legal battle, I had crossed a moral Rubicon, and on the other side of it was a solitude I hadn't yet fully imagined. There would be no reconciliation dinners, no softened memories, no Christmases where the past was brushed aside for the sake of grandchildren and stories. There would be silence, and it would be permanent. I had accepted that. In fact, I had chosen it. But I would be lying if I said it didn't ache in the quiet hours of the morning. I turned that ache into action. The money that had been returned to me, less than it should have been, but more than I expected, became something I no longer viewed as inheritance or legacy. It was a tool, a kind of symbolic justice, and I wanted to use it deliberately. I began volunteering at a senior center downtown, not as a participant, but as a mentor and literacy tutor. Most of the men and women who came through those doors had stories not unlike mine, though few had pursued any formal justice. They spoke in soft voices of children who had stopped calling, of apartments sold without warning, of bank accounts that had mysteriously emptied. I listened. I didn't offer advice unless asked. Mostly I listened. It became a kind of unspoken redemption, not just for what had been done to me, but for the years I had spent being blind to the quiet suffering of others in my own community. Margaret had always been more attuned to that than I was. She volunteered. She noticed things. I had spent so much of my life immersed in books and dates and wars of the past that I had often missed the small battles playing out in the eyes of people around me. I didn't want to miss them anymore. Ellis, ever pragmatic, had suggested I consider relocating, perhaps moving into a retirement community of my choosing, now that my autonomy was restored. But I wasn't ready for that. I didn't want another institutional setting, even a well-appointed one. I wanted walls I could paint myself, floors I could sweep, windows I could open without signing a form. I bought a small cottage on the edge of town. Nothing grand, just a 2-bedroom with a garden that had been badly neglected, but still showed signs of life beneath the weeds. It reminded me of myself in a way. Overlooked, written off, but still rooted, still waiting to bloom. I began to spend my mornings with soil on my hands, pulling up the dead things, planting herbs, restoring the faded shape of something once living. It was exhausting work, but honest. It gave back what I gave it. Unlike people. One afternoon, while clearing debris from the edge of the yard, I came across an old birdhouse nailed to a post, half-rotted and leaning sideways. I took it down, cleaned it, repainted it a soft blue, and rehung it in a maple tree near the porch. Within days, a pair of finches began nesting there. I found myself watching them for long stretches, drawn to their ritual of flight and return, the way they built something fragile and persistent with no guarantee of safety. It struck me then that this was what survival looked like. Not triumph, not vengeance, but quiet continuity. You just kept building, even after the storm, even if no one noticed. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. David's. I stared at it for several minutes before opening it. Inside was a single page, handwritten, no greeting, no date. It read, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About being seen. I don't know if I can undo what we did. I don't even know if I understand fully why we did it. Maybe we were afraid. Maybe we were greedy. Maybe both. But I do remember the man you were. I remember the man who stayed up late helping me with math, even when you were tired. I remember the man who sat through every horrible school play. I remember the man who made me feel safe during the years when everything else felt like it was falling apart. I don't know if I deserve to be your son anymore, but I do know that I will never forget what I've done. I'm sorry." There was no signature, no return address, no phone number, just the words, folded neatly, like a confession buried between bills and catalogues. I read it once, then again. And then I placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Not because I planned to respond, at least not yet, but because something in me, despite everything, still needed to believe that remorse could exist without an audience, that not every apology required applause. That night, I walked out onto the porch and sat in Margaret's old rocking chair, which I had finally brought over from storage and repaired. I looked up at the stars. I thought of the boy David used to be, the boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee, the boy who once gave me a Father's Day card that said, "You are my hero," in shaky block letters. And I thought of the man he had become, the one who let fear or ambition or cowardice turn him into a stranger. I felt no hatred, only distance, a great, unbridgeable distance, but also, strangely, no longer the need to shout across it. Let it remain what it is. Let the silence speak now. As I sat there, the finches chirping above, the scent of earth and mint drifting in from the garden, I understood that the fight, as important as it had been, was not the final act. This was the act of rebuilding, of choosing what to carry and what to leave behind, of making peace not with those who had harmed me, but with the man who had survived it all and come through intact, even if marked. Margaret used to say that grace is not something you receive. It's something you give when you no longer have anything left to lose. Maybe she was right. Maybe this, then, was grace. And maybe that was enough. It's been over a year now since the lawsuit ended, since the final judgment was issued and the legal dust settled over what remained of a family I once believed unbreakable. I don't speak to my sons anymore. Not because I'm angry, though I was once, but because there comes a point when silence becomes the only honest language left between people who have buried too much truth to excavate anything worth rebuilding. I've come to understand that closure doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it's simply the ability to live without flinching when you hear their names, to remember what was without reopening the wound of what became. The house I now live in, modest as it is, has become something more than shelter. It is a perimeter I control, a boundary between who I was and who I refuse to be reduced to. I fill my days with quiet purpose. Reading, gardening, sometimes tutoring local kids whose parents are too busy to help with homework. And once a month, I visit a community group for older adults who've gone through similar legal or emotional battles. We don't speak in cliches or pretend to be heroes. We talk about paperwork and fear, about loneliness and clarity, about what it feels like to outlive your usefulness in the eyes of the people you loved most. And somehow, in that sharing, there is something close to healing. The most surprising part of my new life isn't the independence I fought for. It's the depth of peace that has followed. Not joy, exactly. Joy is loud and temporary. Peace is quieter, deeper, earned. It's in the way the sunlight filters through the curtain in the early morning, the way the kettle whistles and no one rushes you to pour, the way the mailbox no longer contains surprises that require lawyers. I thought I would spend the rest of my life waiting for some grand restoration, a moment when the people who hurt me would fall to their knees in recognition of what they'd done. But now I see that this need was just another form of dependence, another tether to the past. What I needed wasn't their remorse. What I needed was space and time and the right to write the ending myself. Occasionally I wonder what Grant and David tell people now, if they lie, if they spin it, if they speak of an ungrateful father or a legal misunderstanding or a breakdown in communication. But I find I don't care. Reputation, like inheritance, is a fragile thing, and I've learned that clinging to either can make you bitter. I don't need to be vindicated in every room I'll never enter. I was vindicated where it mattered, in court, in the mirror. In the small, quiet fact that I now sleep through the night without dread curling in my chest. I've rebuilt something they never expected I could. Not a fortune, not a facade, but a life. Whole, humble, honest. Sometimes I sit on the porch and watch the seasons shift. I think of Margaret and I speak to her, not in grief anymore, but in gratitude. I tell her what I've planted. I tell her I miss her. I tell her I'm all right. And then I go inside, boil water for tea, and return to my books, my peace, my solitude. I am no longer waiting to be rescued, forgiven, or remembered. I am simply living. And for the first time in a long time, that is enough.